Hi, my name is Tim Martin. I'm talking to you from Loughborough University, and I'd like to kick off by thanking Francesco Proto for inviting me to speak to you, the students of the M.Arch at Oxford Brookes University. I look forward to meeting you in person perhaps one day, but I'm going to talk today about something that came up in a kind of conversation with Francesco, which was about the architect's ego and how, in some respects, there's a sort of choice out there, a stark choice between being absolutely egotistical and doing that all the way, or absolutely losing your ego. And both are very real alternatives today. And I guess what I wanted to do today was to talk about a sort of alternative, if you like. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to put on my glasses because I've written this out and done some slides for you. So the alternative to this, being really egocentric or giving up your ego, what I want to say is that the alternative is to know your desire, and out of that become super creative, and to find the way to let the client's desire drive the project while at the same time you change the client's desire so that it emerges as something that they might not have even asked for. So I want to call this the architect and the subversion of desire. And this is a concept taken from Freud and Lacan. And what I'm really going to argue today is that the way to be an architect today is to work much in the way that a psychoanalyst works, where real creativity only emerges in response to the patient's questions and expectations. For the psychoanalyst, the patient's voice and background should be prioritized over the analyst's egocentrism. And indeed, this method of the psychoanalyst is really what it means to be creative today. So, in the 1960s, I'll just bring up my first slide here, we had an Italian movement in architecture called Superstudio, who advocated the disappearance of the architectural discipline in favor of a bottom-up approach to architecture. This was called architecture without architects, and it's still going on now. So the very question arises, how can we be better architects rather than just passive and blind instruments of financial and political forces? Well, the Superstudio answer was in some respects to sit and do nothing. It was a passive resistance to a nasty big other. It is a solution such that we retire to the woods, build a hut, and whittle spoons or grow mushrooms. In this solution, you give up your ego. Now, I think this withdrawal from doing architecture is nothing more really than a waypoint to something else. And this is the problem. And this is not always really discussed, partly because so many architecture historians, theorists, and teachers have themselves withdrawn from doing architecture, and I count myself amongst this. So it can be a touchy subject. It's a kind of opposite to the architect who goes out to practice for his ego, conquering perhaps the partnership of an international firm or erecting giant monuments to their creative powers. So what I want to do is sort of argue that psychoanalysis can help find the answer, or at least an alternative to this. But this means it may be taking a little bit of a new measure of the way architecture has for some time maintained a relationship to critical thinking, perhaps particularly as it's taken place in the field of philosophy, but also elsewhere. Architecture as a disciplinary world has its satellites. There's Derrida, there's Foucault, Marx, of course, Baudrillard, the Frankfurt School, I could go on. It's challenging to tell the story of this interdisciplinary interaction, if only because your methods would have to be taken from one of those philosophical schools and be very much implicated in the analysis. So let's not start there. Let's start with something a little bit simpler. which is the way we write the history of architecture as a discipline. And I'd like to spend just a few moments thinking like a structuralist in the method of Roland Barthes. And from this perspective, whether we're reading Pevsner or Banham or Jenks or Frampton, what we tend to find is the story of architecture as a series of subversions or challenges. So, just crack open the page and you'll see that Le Corbusier challenged the precepts of Victorian architecture, or in the 60s, functionalism challenged the old school aesthetics. Later on, Jenks will tell us how postmodernism challenged modernism, and Frampton will tell us how regionalism conquers globalism. So numerous are the theories of how architects challenge the system, fight for the rights of the working class over the ruling class, or for the rights of the individual over the committee. In effect, they tell the story of architecture as a challenge to the big other, whatever it may be. My structuralist method is here to point out how, with this basic premise of subverting the big other, built right into the story of architecture, historians can then build up a narrative facade from that about the architect's great insights, his struggles, his courage, all in a triumphalist tale. Such built stories are usually equipped with familiar elements, such as the loggia of genius, the lobby of progress, the enfilade of beauty, the hall of the people, etc., etc. In other words, all the telltale tags of a kind of ideological story. Now, a little bit of structuralism here helps us see how we structure the discourse of architectural history as a meaningful discourse. Whether it's Pevsner or Banham or Jenks or Frampton, the story is that the architect subverts the big other. Now, sometimes architecture's philosophical satellites play into this narrative. So, for example, Jacques Derrida and Bernard Tschumi subvert the master narratives. Foucault subverts the architecture of discipline and punish. Deleuze and Guattari subvert the machines and flows of the big other by bypassing, folding, and reordering them. Now, while this is a familiar narrative that plays into familiar feelings and emotions, this isn't the narrative we should expect to extract when an architect sits down to read Freud or Lacan. When it comes to Freud and Lacan's values to architects, it's that architecture history is so often told in a way that really thwarts the psychoanalytic lesson. Well, what then exactly is the lesson we're meant to take away here from psychoanalysis, at least for today? Well, I think there are a couple. The first is that the architecture history isn't really a game of the architect subverting the big other. It's the pleasure of the architect's desire winning out over the big other's desire. We need to rewrite this just a little bit. And it makes it clear that the story of architecture is the story of desire. Say, rather than a type of story about the political, economic, scientific, technological, or aesthetic, architecture histories are a story of desire first and foremost. And this is why it really counts what history you believe in, because really it's a belief in the desire of the architectural historian. Now, maybe this is a little bit difficult to grasp, the history of desire, as it were, especially because it runs so much against the grain of familiar narratives. But also not. As Alexander Pope once put it, know thyself, then, presume not God to scan, the proper study of mankind is man. So, if the first lesson from Freud and Lacan is that we should look at the history of architecture as a history of desire, then the second lesson I want to pluck out of Freud and Lacan here, is the story of how the architect learns to subvert their own desire. It's not a battle of their desire against the desire of the big other. The psychoanalytic trick is to learn to subvert your own desire. Now, how does this work? First of all, this means the architect becoming conscious of their own unconscious desire. It means having some kind of adequate distance for self-observation of your own desire, or for finding someone else who can observe it for you. It means asking, be it an architect or an architecture historian, why am I drawn to stories in which the architect genius subverts the other? Or why am I drawn to stories in which the architect brushes aside an antiquated other to usher in a new progressive future of happiness and fulfillment? What in the desire of the architect is satisfied by that narrative? Because the narrative is just a narrative. The real truth lies in the desire. As a way of becoming a better architect, then, what Freud and Lacan have to offer is a way of knowing your own desire for what it is. Or here is where we need to start. Now, this can have a lot of applications. So let me give you 3 examples. 1 from psychoanalysis, and then 2 from the field of architecture, so we can understand the general concept and something of how we might apply it. So, for my first example, let me point out that it is an occasional practice for psychoanalysts to gather, and one reason they do so is to discuss how their own analysis helps them manage their patients. In analysis, patients transfer their feelings onto the analyst, and even the analyst can transfer feelings, counter-transfer them back onto the patient. Now, this needs to be managed, particularly when the analyst struggles with them. And this is done in their own personal analysis, and very often discussed at conferences as a way of the profession supporting itself, as it were, with its own methods. The objective here is to be fully conscious of your desire in order to be capable of understanding it and subverting it, doing something with it. Among psychoanalysts, the question even comes up something like this if it had been set as a kind of essay paper question. Using psychoanalytic methods, why are you attracted to psychoanalysis? What brought you to it? How do you use psychoanalysis to subvert and understand your own desire? What I'm proposing here is that there is something in the model of this psychoanalytic job that could be transferred and is now being transferred over to architecture as really the wisest way to operate between having no ego at all and being some kind of enormous egomaniac. Well, let me take an example here, straight from the architect's office. And this is an example that will get us part way to what I'm saying. And this is the story of the architect Peter and his larger practice. Now, Peter, the architect, met his wife at university. She was studying a very related design field, and their student design collaborations became a part of their growing intimacy, a way, in fact, that they learned about each other. After 6 years of marriage, they had fostered a successful design partnership, but it was going a bit sour. The arguments between them particularly stemmed from Peter bringing an increasingly anxious and dogmatic approach to design, and to the design practice in general. He started obsessing over every detailed drawing, asking them to be done over and over. He started to be cynical and slightly bitter, which was unusual too. As a consequence of this, their professional design collaboration suffered, and others in the office were unhappy too, partly for commercial reasons. Then, they consulted a marriage counselor. And after a number of sessions with the marriage counselor, Peter was encouraged to consult a psychoanalyst. From the marriage counseling, he could see, in fact, that it was him that was initiating the conflict. But he didn't really understand his own desire, or why it was he was doing this, why he felt so anxious. Well, if you put yourself in the position of Peter's analyst, you can imagine how tedious the initial analytic sessions were, in which Peter talked endlessly of his irritable concerns over the doorknob and which window casing to use. For many sessions, all he did was rehearse his arguments over a floor plan, location, the size of a garden, how a kitchen or a living room should relate to each other. He brought the marital arguments to the analyst, seeking affirmations of his views. His over-rationalizations, his love it or hate it attitude, his insistence that it be just so, soon led to a diagnosis of neurosis. And after this diagnosis, analysis helped him understand that his design dogmatism, which is a form of the pleasure of making and following the rules, was a kind of replacement for a pleasure that had been repressed. A desire that needed to be understood and subverted. His behavior was a kind of metaphorical replacement pleasure that stood in for the pleasure of something else, which, to the analyst, turned out to be found in the way he talked about the design of houses. Now, as Peter traversed his analysis over the months, he began to see that what he wanted to build was his own house, and he wanted to start a family. Peter and his partner wife had been putting it off and had stopped talking about it, but his unconscious had not. After his analysis, as Peter later put it, now I know that every time I feel like over-detailing the design of a house, I know I want to have another child. Now, these realizations really went a long way to restoring the great deal that their marriage was, and their business too. The message had, for a while at least, been decoded or excavated, enough that they built their house and had their children. Now, not everyone who wants it just so is a neurotic. What a neurotic asks for, his demand, is a compensation or metaphor for what they do not know they want. And psychoanalytic method allows the architect to ask questions such as, what is the unconscious wish behind the architecture? It's an interesting and valuable question, and one that is refreshingly different from speculations about conscious intentions or ulterior motives of a person. It complicates our understanding of architecture as a sublimation of unconscious thoughts and wishes. Now, although Peter's is a very simple case, it is sufficient, I hope, to get the architectural fields to think about the ways they regularly get implicated in the unconscious desire of their clients. In this case study, floor plans, elevations, and models were for Peter a screen that blocked an unconscious thought. The architectural design process acted to hide the unconscious wish or thought. It was a part of a repression and a projection involving a swap or a metaphor for another desire. Although architecture is a visual art, architects need to be aware of the way that many people are simply blind to the cause of their desire. And this blindness can come in many places in the design process. This blindness can be big enough to hide an elephant in the room. Now, an awareness of unconscious desire is quite evident in the conversations between architects and clients if you think about it, and you need to. They often tacitly understand how architecture features as a screen for a wish that the client cannot articulate, or which keeps appearing as if from someplace else or from someone else. Sometimes it isn't necessary to see through the screen of the client. It's enough just to see that there is one. Now, I mention this because some architects seem to, in a funny kind of way, design a kind of architectural psychoanalytic treatment for their clients. A place that allows the fundamental fantasy to be presented, is sublimated into something more acceptable. Now, these individual cases, say of Peter and so on, are very interesting. But what I'm talking about, I think, is also relevant when architects are asked to mediate in the larger social sphere. So, as Peter learns to subvert his desire to know what his unconscious is up to, he becomes able to move on to an even more impressive stage of what you might call super creativity. In this kind of subversion of desire, there's a kind of greatness as an architect, but it is of the type that we do not speak of enough. And this is the architect who can be the cause of desire in the other. The architect who can set the ball of desire rolling for society at large, and in a new kind of desire at that. Now, to give an example of this, my third case study is that of Robert Smithson, that great font of inspiration from the 1960s for architects and artists alike. Now, this example starts with the question, how does the architect act so as to be the cause of a desire in someone else? This is the job of the psychoanalyst. Now, the answer here is that the architect able to subvert their own desire, as Peter learned to do, it is only from there that you are really able to be the cause of desire in someone else. How do we get people to desire what it is we are offering? Is by offering something that is a solution to a desire they did not know they had. For Smithson, in subverting your own desires, which is pretty effectively, by the way, for him, meant diving into the shit and the taboo, you act in a way that brings you back with special powers not available to those who safely stayed in their lane. Now, in some respects, Smithson's is an example that is true to its historical and cultural context of the United States in the early years of postmodernism. But in another sense, there's something generally in that for Smithson, the first great practitioner of this art of architecture capable of subverting the desire of the other was the prehistoric shaman. Today, we call her the architect. Now, in explaining this, Smithson cited Mary Douglas, the structuralist anthropologist at Oxford at the time, who wrote about the role of the shaman. Her book, Purity and Danger, was an anthropological and psychoanalytic study of the taboos around waste and pollution in pre-industrial societies. Now, in these totemic societies, rituals of exclusion and purification created a unity of experience in society that enforced their codes of behavior. In these shamanistic rituals, there was a unique role for the shaman, and their task was to journey out of the social order into an undifferentiated formlessness in order to return and reintroject society with a new sense of order. The descriptions Douglas gives of those shamans who enter into the taboo areas, who risked impurity and disorder, was that it brought them special social powers. The man who comes back from these inaccessible regions of the mind brings with him a power not available to those who have stayed in the control of themselves and society. Now Smithson wasn't trying to imitate the shaman, but here he learned of the long and varied history of practical social power exercised by shamans through the creation of totems and taboos that restricted behavior towards new ends, and that could include a changing attitude towards the land. New stories, new relationships with the land were created and structured by these shamans. In understanding and subverting their own desire, they were able to change the desire of others. Now, prompted by Douglas, Smithson began to be of the view that social change might ensue in contemporary society if an artist instantiated the right totemic language and stimulated the right taboos. For Smithson, our future tended to be prehistoric and needed to rediscover totem and taboo as the primary leverage at the level of desire for the architect. Now, the example of Smithson's that I want to cite here is called Broken Circle Spiral Hill, and it was built in Holland in 1970 when Smithson was asked to provide a sculpture for a sculpture festival to be held in a park in the city. Now Smithson attended and looked around, but none of the ideas he brought with him were suitable to the site. He was looking at sloped forms, and Holland, as you may know, is pretty flat. What he started to do on their encouragement was to begin to look around the landscape, and along the way, staying with various people in Holland, he began to get to know the people, including their history of dealing with the land in relation to flooding. Holland, as you may know, is a country that literally builds itself mile by mile out into the sea. And on a number of instances, very notable in the historical consciousness of the Dutch, floods came back in, destroying and killing many. Well, Smithson's response, then, in looking around, was to find this rare site in Holland that had some kind of slope, and to begin to build not a sculpture for a park, but an entire park. As it were, not a sculpture in a park, but a site of time. What this sculpture did was establish this spiral hill, in which you walked up and around, throwing your consciousness and your attention outward to the landscape around you, binding you to it until you reach the top. And from there, you're able to look down at the broken circle, which is both the jetty built out into the sea, but also the rupture of the water back into the land, here as it circles around this strange giant rock that had rolled out of the hill. What Smithson was doing was kind of acting like a psychoanalyst. He'd been asked for a sculpture in a park, but listening more carefully to their unconscious. What he built was a place where people could come and enjoy the water again, and in so doing overcome the traumas that they had suffered in the floods. It was a way for them to love the land again, to renew their bond with the land in a way that was fundamentally erotic rather than exploitative. Indeed, as it turned out, the people of the city of Emmen here loved the place. They came out, they sunbathed, and in the end, this private sand quarry was turned into a public park. So this is an example of what I mean by the architect coming to the point where they are able to subvert their own desire, in so doing be blank in terms of their desire, listen more carefully to the desire of the other, and instead of giving them what they consciously ask for. Give them what they unconsciously desire. That is the point of the architect and the subversion of desire. Now, I hope you grasp that, but in case you don't, let me just give you one more example. And this comes from the design firm called Snøhetta and a work that they did in Norway. Now, in this project, the client came to them asking basically for 2 toilets and a bench. They had near the town a rather beautiful coastal walk and a place to park, and 2 portaloos and a bench. This didn't seem to match up to the power of the experience that you had walking along this seaside coastline. And so Snøhetta set to work. On the site, they found a radar station. You can see it, it's that form right there at the top on the horizon on the right. This was a radar station set up in Norway, which is a major member of NATO, and was part of Britain and NATO's defense against the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union would basically have to fly over Norway to drop their nuclear bombs on us. There on the site, they found a ruin, a relic of a way of thinking, a kind of Cold War consciousness that very much dominated the imaginations and the unconscious of all of those who lived through the Cold War, which was an age in which we could see the total extinction of mankind and basically every mammal on the planet with 15 minutes notice. This set your consciousness. It enlivened your mind to political philosophy, because this was a battle between communism and capitalism, communism and democracy. Our consciousness, as it were, was flooded by this political situation, this political notion of the land. Now, what Snøhetta has done here is given you, well, a bench, a giant round bench, in which the visitor, on the one hand, can look up to the radar station and be in that consciousness that so dominated European and American thinking from the 1950s almost right up to 2000. And then a giant gyrational space in which you turn away from that desire, that a relationship to the land, which is fundamentally political, then to the other great object that sits there, which is this fantastic, jagged, edged, steep outcrop of rock. Here, what they are doing is subverting the old desire, this old political, philosophical way of relating to the land, and turning it more to a nature philosophy, more to today's concerns, which are much more about our survival in relation to nature, the planet, global warming, and that kind of thing. So yes, the desire that was presented to the architect here was, well, we would like something a little bit more nice than 2 portaloos and a metal bench. Have you got any ideas? Their answer here was to subvert that desire and give them something that at an unconscious level they really needed. That is a kind of greatness as an architect that isn't about being a superego, or it isn't about effacing your ego. It's about subverting your own desire, and from there learning to be the cause of desire in the other. That's it. So thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it. I suppose now we should stop this video and take a few questions.